I'm happy to stand and speak to part two of this piece of this infrastructure legislation. I think it's important to reiterate that this work started under the Labor government. We're 2 years into the national government, still passing Labor legislation. That's all right. We prefer to pass more Labor legislation, a little bit less National Party legislation if possible, so we're not going to complain about that. This part is incredibly important, Mr Chair, because access to the transport corridor varies so greatly. It varies greatly across different local government jurisdictions. It varies greatly across all the different statutes. And of course, as time has gone on, we've ended up in a situation where communities that were previously not connected to reticulated water and wastewater are now connected, so that infrastructure has stretched out further and further. It's affecting more and more communities. Where once upon a time perhaps electricity infrastructure was the only infrastructure that went out to a lot of these communities, now there's so much more. Of course, we have broadband infrastructure. Apparently, according to the government, we don't know if we'll ever actually see it, and when we do see it, it will probably only go to people's streets, not to their houses, which seems to be a little bit of a waste of infrastructure, and I certainly hope that that won't be the case. But of course, if we're going to be extending and adding more and more infrastructure, it makes sense to start to regulate and try and bring together in a coherent way access to that infrastructure. Mr Chair, one of the big issues has been the difference in treatment for different utility operators, and that has created a large amount of tension. It's not tension that is necessarily going to be legislated away by this bill, although I do think that this piece of legislation will be a good start in trying to bring some consistency to that. But the fact is, when you have so many different local authorities all doing different things, and organisations, a single organisation, for example, that has to work in every single local authority across every single statute that relates to infrastructure, you can imagine how difficult that becomes. But, Mr Chair, I want to talk, and I want to mention, because no one's mentioned it yet, the impact on the public of this legislation. Because one of the things that really, really annoys the public is when they drive down a road that's being dug up and something's being replaced, like a water main, and then 6 weeks later they drive down and exactly the same piece of road is being dug up for something completely different. And it's been... David Bennett and his usual excellent contribution to the House. I won't even bother to repeat it, Mr Chair. It's not worth it. Because if he was listening to what I was saying, I was pointing out that one of the things that I hope this legislation will result in is a far more coherent approach to when this work is being done. If all infrastructure operators know that a certain piece of road or rail corridor is going to be open for work, traffic's going to be diverted, the road's going to be dug up, then they can know that, well, we've got some maintenance work that needs to be done on electricity infrastructure or broadband infrastructure. It makes sense, it's cheaper to do it at exactly the same time. And what this does is it reduces the amount of time where the public is being inconvenienced by major works being carried out. Now, this seems relatively simple, but of course, because none of this has been brought together before, because none of these organisations are able to work with each other in this way effectively because of a lack of coherence, that hasn't been happening. And I think sometimes when we deal with a piece of legislation that's very technical like this, we forget the public in that process. And in fact, when it comes to the development and the maintenance of infrastructure, the public are an incredibly important part of that, because part of the reason we've ended up in a situation where local authorities are resistant to allowing access to the corridor is because they come under enormous public pressure. They come under enormous public pressure from their voters who say to them, we're sick and tired of our roads constantly being dug up for no reason, so they start to put more stringent requirements on those utility operators. And in fact, utility operators have to be able to get in. They have to be able to do the maintenance work, because if they don't do the maintenance work, it's far more expensive in the long term. But when they're constantly up against a city council that's having to try and pull all these groups together, try and deal with utility operators that are working in a huge number of different local government areas, huge number of different rules and regulations, that's where the public start to be left out of the equation. And that's where you start to see the public being disadvantaged and far more than they need to be. And so it's not something that many people have talked about, but that would be a very, very good outcome from this piece of legislation. A very, very good outcome if we start to see